Hello, I'm back to continue our journey through Grand Duke Dmitri's diaries. So we're getting to know the little guy. He's still a kid, and I'm losing track of how many of these episodes there have been. So I'm just going to say that this time we'll start with 17th of January 1906, and hopefully have time to do the 18th of January as well. So we do have a few introductions this time, some people that are mentioned. The first one is Christian IX, the King of Denmark, who had just died, and he was 88 years old, and I think 88, I don't know what month he was born, and he was Dmitri's great-grandfather. He was the father of the man who became George I of Greece, and that was Dmitri's grandfather. So Dmitri's Greek relatives were actually not Greek, but Danish and Russian, even though they were the Greek royal family. So George I of Greece was the father of Dmitri's mother, Princess and then Grand Duchess Alexandra. So yes, great-grandfather. I don't know if Dmitri ever met him or not. He doesn't say. So we go from an 88-year-old to an 8 or 9-year-old. Again, I don't know the month, the birth month of this person, who was Boris Georgievich Laming, called Borya, a little boy of 8 or 9, as I said, and he was the son and only child of the man and woman who were, for all intents and purposes, raising Dmitri and his sister, George and Maria Laming. And the next person, an old man by the name of Mikhail Pavlovich Danielov. He was 80 years old, if I'm not mistaken, and he was a person who was attached to Dmitri's now deceased uncle, or had been attached to Dmitri's now deceased uncle, Grand Duke Sergei. In addition to being the Governor General of Moscow, Grand Duke Sergei had been the commander of the Moscow military district. So Russia was divided into military districts, and he had been Sergei's assistant in that capacity, his assistant as the commander of the Moscow military district. So then we have two new teachers whom we haven't met yet, and one of whom Dmitri hadn't met until the day that he wrote this diary entry. This was a history teacher named Galavan and an anatomy teacher who, or biology, I suppose, who is identified by Dmitri by the initial B and then an abbreviation of his surname, I-O-N, Ion, dot, we don't know what the rest of the name is. So here's the diary for the 17th. I was scared this morning because I had my first history lesson with a new teacher. His name is Galavan. He asked me about everything and I didn't know much. Oi, not much. In the afternoon I had B. Ion, who will now come to us 3 days a week. I haven't forgotten anatomy. Today it was about the eyes. Very interesting. Yesterday, poor great-grandfather died, but he passed peacefully and painlessly because it was just from old age. There was a memorial service for him at 8 o'clock. I really don't like memorial services now because they remind me so much of the memorial services I attended so often in Moscow for Uncle. So what to say about that? So this anatomy teacher or biology teacher Dmitri specifies is coming to us 3 days a week. So he must have been teaching not only Dmitri but Maria, and they also seem to have had their math lessons together, but not the history or the woodworking lessons. So we've talked about great-grandfather, and the interesting thing that this brings up is that Dmitri would be attending a memorial service, and we get a little bit of insight into how the death of his uncle on February 4th, 1905, the previous year, had affected him. So great-grandfather would have been a Protestant, I guess a Lutheran, but Grand Duke Sergei, of course, was Orthodox. And in the Orthodox Church, you have memorial services, I think. Good Lord, it's Saturday. I need to go to church tomorrow and renew my acquaintanceship with all of these things. So I think you have them once, so the first week after the death of the person, and then once a month for a year, and then after that, just once a year on the anniversary of that person's death. And so it could have been that there were more memorial services for Grand Duke Sergei after his death than was typical. And so, there could have been one for the military district, and one for, who knows. But apparently, however many they were too many for Dmitri. And it would have been a very difficult and traumatic time for him. And so now he has this association of memorial services with what happened to his uncle. I don't know, maybe they had an Orthodox memorial service for Christian IX in Russia, but whether it was or wasn't, he had this difficult association. So a memorial service in the Russian Orthodox Church is called a panikhida. And if you read any of the diaries of any members of the imperial family, you might come across this word, because even when they were writing in English, that was the word they used rather than memorial service. Okay, so that's it for the 17th. We do have time for the 18th. Today I did well in geography and anatomy, so-so in Russian, but not particularly well in arithmetic. Today that old man, Mikhail Pavlovich Danilov, died. Aunt in Moscow is probably very sad about it, and it's really bad timing because I haven't gotten around to writing her. I'm terribly ashamed. I'm aware of the shamefulness of it myself, but still, I just can't gather the courage to do it. I've suddenly started playing toy soldiers more with Borya, which is quite funny because at one point I had gotten tired of toy soldiers. I keep wanting to work after dinner and plane some wood, but I can't. I keep thinking that the whole thing seems a little embarrassing because I'm already 14 years old and I still love playing with toy soldiers. Very strange today. It wasn't very frosty, only 12 degrees, so naturally I wore my autumn coat when I went for a walk. Tomorrow is my history lesson, only the second. It's very scary because I don't know history that well. For example, last time I didn't know what feudalism was. It's quite embarrassing but not surprising because I haven't studied history for almost 2 months. Okay, so it's possible for a Grand Duke writing in the early 20th century to be very relatable in a lot of ways. And in this instance, certainly, he has procrastinated when it comes to writing a letter to his aunt in Moscow. And now it's even harder because he's ashamed of his procrastination, and he says, I just can't gather the courage to do it. So that, believe me, I can relate to, not so much with letters, but with email. So Borya and the toy soldiers, it's really quite charming. You know, he thought he'd given that up, but he realized that he liked playing toy soldiers with this little 8 or 9-year-old. It was fun. And so good for him. You know, you could say that it was an indication that at 14 he was still rather immature, but in fact there were a lot of grown men who liked playing with toy soldiers. There's a book that was written by H.G. Wells in England called Little Wars, and it's an absolutely charming book. If you can find it, I think you can download it free or for just a few dollars online. I have a copy, and it's about a whole system that he and his friends came up with for playing with toy soldiers and making little villages and things like that, and what the rules were. And Dmitri himself would start playing similar games with his brother-in-law, Gulia, in 1919, and enjoy those very much. And I don't know if he was using H.G. Wells' system or not, but it was definitely early days for tabletop war games, or war games played on the floor with actual printed instructions. So let's see, the other thing, let's talk just for a second about his history lessons. He had not been studying for 2 months. He'd had a long holiday, at least from history. So he would have stopped basically in November with Advent, having history lessons for whatever reason. And so now he finds himself in the awkward position that genuinely bothers him of not having much knowledge or memory of what he's learned in the past about history. And he specifically brings up the subject of feudalism, which this new teacher Gallivan had asked him about, and he didn't know what it was. And I would love to know what exactly he was being taught, or what he would subsequently be taught about feudalism, because it's something that if you take Russian history courses now in university, it's something that is discussed as a question, an open question as to whether you can say that Russia ever did have feudalism, which is, of course, a system where you have a king, but you also have these quasi-independent nobles who have their own little, well, not kingdoms, but their own little feudal estate, and raise their own armies and to in the service of the king, strictly. So you had these people in Russia before the imperial age called boyars, and boyars also were responsible for serving the Tsar. The Tsars weren't emperors yet, and for providing troops from their serfs. So, like little militias who could come to the aid of the Tsar, and there wasn't a standing army at that time. So it sounds like feudalism, but the idea was that the boyars, unlike these feudal nobles, were considered to be really just vassals, almost slaves of the Tsar, because the Tsar was the only person who had free will and free agency, and the boyars were bound to him to the same extent that the serfs were bound to the land. And so, could you call that feudalism? Well, I don't know enough about feudalism. I hope my explanation wasn't completely inept, but it is an issue within Russian history. It was an issue to socialists, because in Marxism there's the idea that you go through certain definite and necessary stages of history, and before you can get to socialism, let alone communism, you have to pass through feudalism, and you have to pass through the last stage. Before you get to socialism, you have to pass through capitalism. And I think, if I remember correctly, one of the reasons why Karl Marx didn't think that there would or should be a revolution in Russia, and he was against trying to bring one about, is because Russia had not passed through these stages, and therefore a revolution would be disastrously premature. And he saw it more as something that should happen in England or Germany or any other country that had gone through these specific historical stages. So, unfortunately, there's nothing that Dmitri says subsequently about what he was told by his history teacher, and if he was told that Russia had indeed experienced feudalism. Oh well, so it goes, and I'll be back next time with probably 3 diary entries, maybe 4, because they're short, the 19th, the 20th, and then he skips to the 23rd and the 24th. And these are, we're coming into more of him talking about his experience with his uncle's death and his relationship with his aunt, who was technically his custodial parent, but who was living in Moscow. So I hope you'll come back for that. Bye.